Welcome to the Executive Coach Podcast. I am really excited to bring this conversation to you. It is with Stephen D'Souza, who is the author of Not Doing, as well as various other books that we're going to talk about over the next couple of episodes. Regular listeners this year will notice that we have talked quite frequently about moving to more of a surrender and goal-free state, which, if you're a high achiever, can sound a little bit weird or even wrong. But to me, it's been a theme that's been impossible to ignore. It's kind of come and found me and has felt too important not to share with you guys. And what I think is really important in this conversation is that we talk about going with the river rather than trying to force against it or push against it. We talk about letting the mud clear rather than reacting too quickly. And actually, what we come up with is the idea that this isn't about sacrifice. You don't have to give up ambition and drive if you want to do less. In fact, it might be the very thing that makes your next level of success possible. So this is a super powerful conversation, and nice story about how Stephen and I came across each other. My husband actually mentioned him to me when I was entering this leadership development space as a role model, someone to look up to who was doing, really great things in the leadership development space, because he had known him for a long time. And so when Stephen approached the podcast, it was an instant yes from me. He didn't know that we had that mutual connection, but I guess I had been admiring him from afar, so I was well aware. So it was really exciting to have this conversation with Stephen. So now let's dive into the conversation. Stephen, welcome, and absolutely brilliant to have you here on the podcast today.
Thank you, Maya. It's great to speak with you, and also to learn before the podcast we have mutual connections, and so it shows how connected the world is. So really happy to speak with you this afternoon.
I know that you have a new book out, which I'm looking forward to diving into, but I also love some of your earlier work, which we're going to start with. And one of those books was called Not Doing, The Art of Effortless Action. And longtime listeners of this podcast will know that I used to open the introduction using words like easeful and effortless. So this is a really natural connection for us here. But my audience is full of amazing high achievers who have often built their success through that relentless doing and being persistent and having the grit and the graft. So what would you love to say to them on this topic?
Yeah, so the aim of Not Doing was to balance the benefits of action, because as leaders we have a bias for action. But how do we make sure that we're not just in overaction or in, talked about relentless action, or that there's some Samantha Ghoshal who talks about the frenetic leader.
Yeah.
And that's what the book seeks to look at, the idea of how do we act, how do we take effective action in a way that's sustainable and has impact. So that was the premise of Not Doing. And it's based on what we call negative capability, which is a phrase that was developed by the poet Keats. And he talked about negative capability as the ability to be with mystery, uncertainty, and doubt without reaching after fact and reason. So that makes it clear in terms of knowledge, but in terms of not doing, what's the side that we don't look at? So, for example, in speech, we privilege the speaker, but not the listener. In action, how do we look at things that support effective action, like pausing, like silence, like stillness, like waiting, like even boredom? And how do we reframe some of these very human abilities to add value and to make us more effective in what we do? And the reason for the book was because very much I think we're caught up in a society that privileges, as you say, this relentless action. And it leads to a burnout culture where we feel exhausted most of the time. Many of your listeners will, that we sort of go through hectic days. We prop ourselves up with coffee in the morning, and then we try to make it through the day and too exhausted in the evening to enjoy maybe time with our families, friends, doing other activities. And we thought there must be a better way. There must be a way that leaders can engage in activity, but not through pushing, not through pulling, but working with the system and almost like going with the energy as it is. So the metaphor that we use is the metaphor of the river, which operates very efficiently, it operates without effort, and it accomplishes an enormous variety of things. So taking that metaphor, what are the kind of capabilities that leaders can develop in order to be more effective? So that's the broader context, trying to balance the overemphasis or overaction with effective and effortless action.
That's just gorgeous, that metaphor of the river. And I have a few other questions for you in there. There was something you mentioned about negative capability. So is that the idea of pause, not doing, and listening rather than speaking?
Yeah, pausing is a very powerful technique that every listener can use, and we don't use it often enough. I'll give you a simple example. Study at the University of Rochester at the medical school said doctors interrupt their patients after an average of 23 seconds with a diagnosis. And if they waited only a few more seconds, 6 more seconds, the patient would reveal something that may change the diagnosis. So that's the power of a pause in thinking about, in terms of actually changing what we'll do and the consequences of that. Now, in the world, another example, the world of sport, think about a very tense basketball game, and it's highly competitive. Both teams are doing well, but there doesn't seem to be a breakthrough. The coach might call a timeout. It might literally be 1 minute, but it changes the whole direction of play after and can make the difference between winning and losing. So I often see in organizations when we're in meetings, etc., we might be just fully going, but taking even a slight pause, a little break to think, to recollect, to reflect, to create some space may change the direction after. So that's the power of pausing.
And I had a client recently, and he was struggling to figure out where there was opportunity for him to do less, because he was feeling so at capacity, but he didn't really feel that there was any room, for maneuver for him. And so we trotted through a few kind of more standard options, and nothing was really working for him. And it was only when he realized that when he himself was more relaxed, when he was more at ease, when he didn't have sort of like completely back-to-back meetings all day, that's when he himself was less reactive. And when he was reactive, his tendency was to react quickly, create a response, create more work. Whereas when he was more relaxed, he was able to let it sit, and then it didn't always need that reaction and activity and generate new projects and new work. And so for him, his way forward came from that negative capability, right? So that doing less, cultivating that mindset, listening and creating space, that ended up being his way forward through this. None of the practical stuff worked. And it was for him to have that powerful realization that actually that's the way that he could make more space for himself, and in turn reduce the cycle of just continuously generating more work.
Yeah, it's a very
Yeah.
powerful story. And more, I think, the overactivity is because of our incapacity to be with ourselves and to be with our own thoughts. I was listening to Arthur Brooks at Harvard earlier today, and he was talking about, his thing was saying people cannot stay with boredom. Like they need to, for example, look at their phone if they have 2 minutes, and this inability to stay with the discomfort of allowing yourself to be with silence a bit more and not filling that space with activity. But the value that he was sharing, and that in not doing, we talk about, was your brain can access a space, they call it a default system, where thoughts can have, the time to emerge, where you can reflect, where new insights can happen, because you're not continually filling yourself with information, but you're allowing that almost like pregnant pause to give birth to something new and that you may have missed. So it is a vital part of leadership. And I think in development for every leader, to learn how to pause more. And in our work environments, we're so busy in managing the present. I think the pause is the vital juncture that enables us to focus on creating a different future. And as leaders, we need to do both, manage the present and create the future, or to perform and transform. And so it's not a luxury, it's a necessity to create pauses and to use that space. And as you say, a lot of it is on this ability to self-regulate, to notice when we want to move away, when we want to almost get that dopamine hit. Notice what happens if we stay a bit longer with ourselves, and what does it bring us? What benefit does it bring? So it's an experiment, I guess.
I love that. And let's just go a bit deeper into that river metaphor, because what I love about that metaphor is that there's still momentum and energy. In fact, there's tremendous force and energy and flow and movement, but it's not being forced, it's natural. And so that's your more effortless achievement and outcomes.
Yeah. There's a famous Gestalt saying, in Gestalt is a form of psychology or psychotherapy, and it's in, don't push the river, it flows by itself. And often we try to push the river. We want to force the seed. We want it to grow faster, but we end up destroying it. We end up destroying the plant, as it were. And there's a sense of working with, as you say, the systems, not trying to and seeing which way they flow, but directing that and having the patience as well to do that. So there's one of the principles in not doing is this idea of let the mud settle, and the water becomes clear by itself. So when we're in, let's say, a situation, it's tempting to be caught up in frenetic activity to try to influence the outcome. But if we just wait a few moments, normally the mud will settle. You can see this in a glass if you shake it, and then the water becomes clear. So it's that ability to think almost and reflect and pause rather than rushing into action, which can be a quick fix, but it may not address the underlying issues that I think we need more the capacity to develop.
I really like all these natural metaphors because, first of all, I love spending time in nature. And I talk about that quite a lot on the podcast, but also just because we see so much activity in nature, don't we? And we see abundance, and we see things happening as they should in a sort of aligned way, in that kind of sustainable pace.
Yeah, you're right. Now, speaking with a friend today, and we talk about the natural rhythms of nature, actually. So it's quite, I think our conversation is quite serendipitous. And he was talking about seasons and rhythms. And like in winter, normally animals, like they start to hibernate, they slow down. And we were talking about this idea of Sabbath, like people have, we have the weekends, but some people in their professional careers take sabbaticals where every, let's say 7-8 years, they might take 6 months of work. And we were sharing how hard it is to do that, how we want to stay active, maybe use that period to write a book or to do an activity, and yet, it offers an opportunity to actually learn, as you say, from the seasons, to say, what is the period that I'm in now? This is a period of quietness, or this might be a period of rest. I think there's a fiction book called Catherine May, who wrote a book called Wintering. And it's the idea, how do we recognize the seasons, not just in the calendar seasons, but in the day as well. There's the time for thinking. So we tend to be, our days tend to be directed by our calendars rather than our energy and by our natural energy. So how do we move more in sync with rhythm? And as you say, with natural rhythms that allow us to be more effective. And that might mean doing, our most important work when we have the most energy and clarity. For some, it will be in the morning. For others, they might be night owls, when they do their most active work. It's interesting that when I was writing my most recent book on the shadow, there was some research by Annabel Abstreet, and she looked at women writers like Virginia Woolf, Catherine Mansfield, and she discovered that they do actually their most creative work at night. And it was a term called their night selves. So when their neocortex is shut down, when the part that filters and modulates our activities, actually they were able to be much more creative and more productive. So each of us has our own natural periods where we feel most engaged, more alive. But I do think that we can learn and to live much more in harmony with our own energies, but also with the seasons. And it's something we don't really reflect on so much as leaders, because we're almost like 24 hours, 7 days a week in all of the calendar months. In the US in particular, with only let's say a 2 week holiday. So it's something I think that's vital to consider, and finding ways that you can get the rest. And that doesn't need to be, sharing something practical with you for listeners. It doesn't need to be take too much time out. I remember saying to my coach, I'm exhausted. And he said, why don't you take a vacation? And I said, I don't have time. He said, I mean now. And I said, what? He said, yes, I want you to take a 30-second vacation. I want you to put down whatever you're holding. I want you to put your hands behind your head. I want you to put your feet up, and I just want you to rest. And you can do this with me now, and your listeners can try this as well. So I want you just to lean back, take a breath, and just allow yourself to sink in and be supported with whatever you're doing. Obviously, if you're driving, this isn't for you, but if you're at home listening, or just experiment with this and notice just allowing your body to relax and allowing all the tension to go. Notice you can take an out breath, and often it's easy to sigh. And allows your body just to go into the relaxed mode. And then when you're ready, just paying attention to your body, where it is, feet on the ground, sounds around you, your center, and coming back. Now, literally, that was 30 seconds. So people don't need a 2-week holiday to put into action not doing. It can happen in as little as 30 seconds. And that can, just be an opportunity to come back a little bit more refreshed. And something simple like a sighing, as I did, the physiology of a deep sigh. It's really relaxing for the body and for the mind, and can allow us to be more effective.
Gosh, I love that. And I absolutely love a mini holiday. So that was very nice in the middle of the podcast to do that. But I think we could all, do with more of that. And actually, when I was studying positive psychology, my master's, there was an intervention that was around mini vacations. And I was very drawn to that at that time, because between full-time work, doing that master's, and having small kids, I didn't really feel like I had any other capacity. And so I was looking for these very tiny solutions that could make a difference. And what I think when you're that busy, even the thought of planning a vacation or a holiday is stressful, right? It's more admin, it's more things to do. It crunches everything up even further. So it's these sort of things that we can build into our day that can give us some of those benefits, but on a more regular basis, not just every however many months, apart our holidays are. So I love that. The other thing that I really enjoyed hearing you talk about was, as a man, talking about seasons and cyclicality, because we talk about that quite a lot on this podcast. And I've had guests coming to talk about the menstrual cycle, and that being a very natural cycle to sort of work with. I listen to a lot of incredible podcasters who talk a lot about your season of life. That's often quite a feminine take, but half of this audience is men, and it's really nice to hear you still taking that approach and finding that to be meaningful and valuable, even if you don't follow the menstrual cycle.
Yeah, I think there's a narrative, and it's for both men and for women, but it's I am what I do, and people, and that belief, your identities in doing and in activity. And that belief, I am what I do, tends to drive, this hyperactivity, and also a sense of loss if people are not doing activity. So, if I'm not engaged in something purposeful, and then the critic comes in, then that means I'm lazy, means I'm squandering time. That was once something that said to me, and I delighted in it because, I have a different concept of time. But the pressure to do is prevalent, and it's in society, and it's a narrative that impacts us all. So I think it's difficult, and it's important just to address that can come in many ways. It can come in like even in the fear of missing out. I want to go to that evening event. I want to read that book. I want to see that movie because others have. So it's almost different ways that presents itself. But in the essence of it is this idea that if I'm not doing, I'm not existing.
And actually, I've been experiencing a version of that myself recently. I was probably much more driven by work, maybe a decade ago. But I'm really noticing a shift in myself, a desire to, have a slower way of being. I think it's always been there, but it's much stronger now. And in the case of my career, a lot of the really buildy bits have been done, doing the masters, doing the publishing, the research. And it's not that I don't want to work. I love my work, but it doesn't mean that I want to go at it the same way that I did maybe a decade ago. And I'm comfortable with that, but I will then every now and then go onto LinkedIn, for example, and I've actually researched this. So I know that it is the worst platform for social comparison out of all of the platforms. It's worse than Instagram. And it's very easy, even if you've gone on there for a specific reason and you've found something to be quite useful, but then you will just be hit by, oh, I could be doing a bit of this, and oh, that could be cool. And unless you are incredibly mindful about it, you can walk off that platform thinking, I should be doing more, I could be doing that. And this is coming from someone, I'm pretty secure in my choices. I've done a lot of work to arrive at them, and I know exactly what the mental impacts are of these social media platforms, and it still impacts me. So I guess what I'm saying is that I don't think the world is set up right now to support us doing less. I think, you have to be, just like they say about things like UPFs and junk food, the world currently is not set up to support us if we want to sort of eat much less processed food. It's currently engineered in a way that unless you're extremely mindful, you could end up falling down a lot of different rabbit holes. So I wanted to really emphasize the difference between the idea of this and then the in practice.
Yeah, it's very difficult. And, there is a tendency for overachievers to take on too much. One of the practices I give if I'm coaching like an overachiever is to say no to a good opportunity every week. So not a bad, but a good opportunity. It's developing that muscle, that capacity to really focus, because I learned this as a therapist. You choose, you lose. There's always a sense of loss in every choice. There's an option or a road not taken. So it's being able to be okay with that. It's being able to say, I made a choice, and I recognize I'm not going to be able to fulfill everything, but I'm choosing this thing, and to do that consciously, intentionally for the life that you do want to create. So this is, I think, an important aspect of, recognizing that there will be a sense of loss, and there is always that comparison, as you say, with others, and we can to be defined by that. And it's recognizing that danger, or almost like that. I think it's like mimetic. We want what others want, and recognizing that that's not what This is where I want to craft my life, what I want my life to be about. And that clarity around your own values, your own priorities, helps it make it easier to say no to things that don't accord with that. One of the most successful people I know is a young guy, but he says 3 things. It's his relationships, it's his health, and it's his business. And everything else he doesn't sort of put any attention to, but he knows that's what his 3 things are, and they direct his choices. So and how he structures his calendar, what he puts in, all by his three priorities, not 5, not 10, just those simple 3. So it's for each of us, it will be different, but I think that clarity helps make choices, and what we want to lose, what we want to say no to.
It's nice to hear, because what I was sharing is, I couldn't be clearer in my own choices, and yet I can still fall prey to external algorithm and societal ideas, right? And unless you're really conscious of it, you can easily, I think, get swayed. And then I think the other piece that you mentioned there, that loss piece and being okay with loss, I find that to be very helpful actually, because sometimes we can be fed this idea that experience of loss and sadness is not okay. Well, actually, no, it's okay to sort of see that for what it is, accept it, and know that that's part of your full choice. And it's if you're being holistic about it, it's one part of the experience. So that's really useful as well, some sort of acceptance piece rather than kind of denial and feeling like everything has to feel great all the time. So I like that. I've got a couple of other questions from you from what you've said. One is that, to the individual listening who's thinking, okay, well, that's all right for you, Stephen, that's all right for you, Maya, you've got more agency in your work, more autonomy, but I'm inside an organization, I've got a boss, a big team, there's so much going on amidst also a really, really uncertain environment, fast pace of change, and cost cutting at the same time. I didn't necessarily ask for all this to be on my plate. And I might have like a family, young family, and other responsibilities as well. How on earth can I do less right now? I can't see a way to do that.
So again, it's not necessarily about doing less, but it's around building your capacity and not overdoing and not doing what isn't necessary. So give you an example. Let's say I'm a boxer and I do boxing, and if I'm fighting like an amateur, they get exhausted very quickly because their body is all tense. They're using every muscle, and after a few minutes, they're out of breath. But the better you become more efficient and more effective. So you're not trying to tense all your body. You've rehearsed, you're practicing, and you become more elegant, and you're using the minimal amount of energy. So it isn't necessarily about doing less, but it's working more efficiently. And the kind of practices that we've talked about, cultivating silence, looking at presence. So when we're doing an activity, is our mind somewhere else, or are we present with the person we're with? We can be far more effective. Learning how to pause, learning how to let the mud settle. Something called beautiful action, which was a term by the philosopher Immanuel Kant. He described it not being driven by moral action, but looking at the completeness of an activity and doing it for itself. So there's many ways that we can reconceive action. That doesn't necessarily, and I don't think there's harm in doing this, by the way. I think that can be more effective sometimes rather than overdoing. There's more impact that can happen with less movement rather than more. But I don't think it means less output. It's funny that when my first job was in hospitality, and when there was less management, when all the management team went abroad for a week on, let's say, a corporate retreat, the business was much more effective. Now, what's going on there. So, there's this idea that you don't, by doing more and being in control more, and that person that you gave the example sounds like they've got a massive team and they're actually, that doesn't necessarily make you effective. So it's almost like that moving from control to trust, and recognizing that effectiveness isn't directly related to, in proportion to the activities that you take. In fact, good leadership isn't that. It should be in what is the capacity of people that you lead? What can they produce because of your leadership and your guidance, not by your own output? I always get frustrated when leaders say they can't go away because they can't do any learning because they're so busy in their day jobs. But that is really why you need to go away for a thing. Because if your team can't do without you, there's something wrong. You're not really leading, you're managing. Yeah. So that, here it's a question of not perceiving, not doing as doing less, but seeing it as, how do I act more effectively, effortlessly, efficiently, and sustainably? And they're the key elements exploring more in depth in the book.
Yeah, and I would say to that, or I would add to that, you can't operate in a way that is more strategic, more efficient, and more effective from a place of frenetic. You have to do it from a place of pause and rejuvenation, and space to actually reflect and think more deeply.
Yes, all the like corporate scandals that have been like studied, and Margaret Heffernan, a writer on this topic in willful blindness. So most of these crises come from environments where there was, people were sleep deprived. They were working, 18-hour days, but that doesn't lead to better decisions. It leads to worse decisions. We'll talk about the shadow, but the shadow, one of the elements in that is not just psychological, it's physiological. So, there's a evolutionary biologist, Robert Sapolsky, he's written a book called Behave and Determined. Says much of our action is based not on our psychology, but our biology and our hormones, and our stress levels. And they influence how we act and how we behave in the world. And so if we're always hustling and working relentlessly, that doesn't necessarily correlate with the most effective actions. In fact, it doesn't. It can result in poor decisions and ineffective action. So, part of it is recognizing what can I do to help myself become more cognizant of the narratives that I have, bought into because of the culture, the team, etc. And how do I start to be more directive of how I want to lead and how I want to set as an example. The best leaders I've worked with are not the forensic leaders, but they sort of seem to be effortlessly relaxed, yet more effective than the ones who are always walking around that pace and seem continuously stressed. And I don't know about you, but if you've approached guests who are extremely busy, they tend to be the ones that reply first, rather than, the ones that are not so busy. And there's this sense of a different relationship to time and a different relationship to activity than this idea that I am, my effectiveness is correlated to my activity, and they aren't necessarily correlated. More activity doesn't equal more effectiveness. So I think that's why the book Not Doing is rethinking our relationship to doing, and how we operate with our, the time, the clock as a lock, almost determining how much time we spend on different activities, to cultivating some of the habits and practices that we talked about earlier in the podcast.
Amazing. And before we wrap up, I have a final couple of questions for you. One of the things you mentioned is that you've got a different relationship to time, perhaps, than others. So I'd love you to share what you mean by that.
I don't wear a watch, and yet I'm always on time. And I don't feel frenzied, or I've never done, 12-hour days. And I would say I'm fairly effective in my work and in what I do. But there's two different, there's the chronological time, and then there's kairos, which is a second definition of time, which is being in the moment and attending to what's in front of you and being effective with that. So for me, my relationship to time isn't as something that I can lose. I can't waste time. So, I'm in, it's something that I'm not ruled by. It's not like something that determines how I operate. And that doesn't mean I'm in some dreamy world. I've got a busy, full of activities, but I'm approaching it from a very different angle. And so it's more a mental shift.
Yes.
Yeah, right now I'm with you. And so I'm present with you. I'm not thinking, okay, in an hour I've got this activity to do. That will take care of itself, but I'm with you in this moment. So my relationship to time, I don't have a belief that I can waste time. Does that sound strange? It probably does. But I don't have a belief that I'm short of time either. So I use the time I have, but I don't have a sense of scarcity around time, and
Yeah.
I don't have a fear of time, as it were. So there is a blog we write about in Not doing, that talk about the clock as a lock, that determines what you can do and how much time you can spend. And there are people that monitor, and they have apps for that monitor every half an hour and productivity. But that can, in my view, lead to an unhealthy relationship with time. And it doesn't reflect how, how activities need to be done. So, for example, if I'm doing a creative activity, I'm not going to try to do that within 10 minutes because 10 minutes is what I have. I'm going to allow that to take the time it needs. And that might sound counter, in fact, in this culture we live in where everything needs to be done urgently and quickly, but it can paradoxically be more effective. So it's allowing us to think about what is the time needed for this particular activity or this task. Going back to what we said earlier about working with our energy rather than being directed by our calendar, and learning how to restore ourselves and look at our own capacity. So we talked about the idea of pausing, the idea of silence, the idea of, I talk about solitude as well in the book, and talk about this sense of surrender. Not surrender something passive or resignation, but something active, actively engaging in the activity and not forcing, but being able to follow. So it's a really interesting topic, and I think I'd love to know more on your thoughts on that. Maybe we can talk about surrender future, but that is, I think it's a very powerful capability, the ability to learn surrendering, and rather not seeing it as something negative, deficient in any way. It's a very powerful tool.
So surrender is my word of the year, and I found it to be a very powerful word this year. On that, what I feel is that there can be a tension between surrender and the river, more of a going with the flow approach, versus ambition, drive, and growth. And I wondered whether you experience that tension or how you reconcile those two things, because you're out there in the world creating, sharing your message, but maybe you're taking more of a surrender approach with that. I would love to hear how you think about those two things.
Again, I don't see them as opposites. I see them as supporting each other. And so being able to be effortless supports high achievement and is a consequence of that. So it's not something that will decrease your ambition or decrease your effectiveness. Actually, being able to be relaxed, be able to be present, being able to be effective, being able to take sustainable action, being able to have levity and lightness rather than being, stressed, and it allows you to be much more, achieve much more. So that's how I would answer that, man.
That is a gorgeous way to wrap up this first part of our conversation. So Stephen, thank you so much for joining us and talking about not doing. I'm really excited for the second part of our conversation, which is going to be about your latest book. For now, tell listeners where they can find you and where they can find this book.
Yes, so thanks. So stephendesouza.com, and all the books are there, and they're also available on Amazon.
Well, thank you all for listening, and I look forward to connecting with you next time with the second part of this conversation with Stephen. Bye-bye.